what this makes me wonder is how the DSM-V functions in your practice and how you balance it with your intuition about what a mental illness is.
Right.
And furthermore, if the DSM-V is at least ideally supposed to delimit just what the mental illnesses are, if it doesn't do that, then what exactly is a mental illness and why might it evade description?
Oh dear.
Huge questions.
Huge
questions.
Yeah. So first of all, let's just talk a little bit about how the DSM is made, right? It's frankly pseudoscientific. It's a bunch of so-called experts getting together around a table saying, we think this is a disorder and should go in the DSM, and then reviewing the available science, and then describing the disorder, and then creating, criteria. So basically, it's a very imperfect process. Experts sitting around a table, sort of trying to say, is this a disorder, coming to some sort of consensus. Many times the experts invited around the table already have, preconceived notions about whether it is or is not. So really it's about, is there sort of more global acceptance, momentum, will to make it something in the DSM. And then essentially you just end up with a bunch, I like I say, it's just like a bunch of different buckets, right? And there's overlap in the symptomatology, but at the end of the day, there's no blood scan or brain test. There's no brain scan or blood test to diagnose any mental health disorder. It's based on what we call phenomenology. So these are patterns of behaviors that repeat themselves across individuals, time periods, demographics, temperaments, that just seem so characteristic of a kind of psychopathology, that is to say, a way of thinking, feeling, behaving that causes harm to self and others in a given time period in a given society, such that we will label this person as in psychological distress, as having a mental illness. And then in our very medicalized modern society, we will then, once they're labeled as a patient, begin to try to treat them. So this is all deeply socioculturally contextual. The DSM is clearly going to be mainly just a shared language, not a deeply scientific kind of construct. And there's a lot to be criticized with it. When I personally think about mental illness, I think about, for me, the best framework is the stress vulnerability diathesis, which is to say, with enough stress, any of us could look crazy, right? So enough sleep deprivation, both you and I would be hallucinating and hearing voices and delusional, right? So essentially that kind of moves around through time, where if you have somebody who with very little so-called stress can have those symptoms, we would tend to say they have a mental illness, or that it's manifest with very little stress. But in other circumstances, we would say, no, that person's not mentally ill, or maybe certain time periods. So for example, one thing that's always fascinated me about patients with bipolar disorder, and this is just an anecdotal personal observation, is that in times of severe stress in their lives, you'll never see anyone more calm. Like they just rise to it. But when things are going better and that stress is off, there can be a very significant mental breakdown. So one of the ways that I think about that is, wow, no wonder bipolar disorder is endemic in the population. In times of great war or famine or what have you, those were probably, we needed those people, right, to be more stable. But now it's kind of a liability. Same thing with addiction. Like I think of addiction, people who are willing to work harder, run faster, swim further to get scarce resources, were people who you absolutely needed to keep the whole tribe alive, right? But now people who are willing to do that, put all that extra work in to get certain rewards in this world of overwhelming overabundance, that turns into a liability.
And a question I have is, if still the DSM-V is sort of the official delineation of what a mental illness is, if another psychiatrist says, my patient so-and-so has a mental illness, it is not covered in the DSM-V, does that supersede the DSM-V if there is some mythical psychiatric body where you all vote on whether or not something is a mental illness? Will you accept the psychiatrist's word that the patient has a mental illness, or will you fall back on the DSM-V and say and overrule the psychiatrist's judgment?
You put a patient into a room with 10 different psychiatrists, you can get 10 different diagnoses. So these are very subjective types of interpretations, and psychiatrists can and do disagree. When it comes to getting reimbursed by third-party payers, it pretty much has to be a DSM diagnosis.
Very interesting.
And some insurers will cover some diagnoses and not others. So you have to have a sort of mind to that too, because if your patient, meets threshold criteria for a certain diagnosis, even if that's not maybe what you think the work has to focus on, you might use that because otherwise they can't get help, right? They can't bill their insurance. So there are so many different factors that go into it. Getting back to food addiction, which is not yet in the DSM, but there's a movement now to get it into the DSM. I can't diagnose food addiction because it doesn't come up on the medical records, right? It's not in there because it's not in the DSM, and insurers won't pay for it. But generally speaking, that's probably the focus of my treatment, using the addiction lens to target the disordered eating rather than using a body dysmorphia, eating disorder lens, which maybe hasn't worked before, hasn't helped that person. So a lot of factors go into that.
If you put a patient in a room with 10 psychiatrists and you get...
Oh, I see. You're stuck on that. You went back to it.
I'm stuck on that because I think it should be intuitively troubling that this is what happens if you give a patient to doctors who hold this very important place in our society, and we go to them for our biggest problems with our health, which are our health problems. And if we get 10 different answers that suggest that there is a startling lack of consistency.
Oh yeah.
Within
we just have to admit that it's not exactly science.